The town of Greensburg, Kansas, sat quiet under a darkening sky. It was the evening of May 4th, 2007, and the air had that heavy, electric feel that folks on the plains know too well. The kind of stillness that makes dogs restless and cattle uneasy. In a town of just under 1,500 people, everyone knew everyone else and they knew the weather. They had to. Living in the heart of Tornado Alley meant that spring was a season of watching the horizon, listening to the radio, and keeping one eye on the clouds. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. It had been a warm afternoon, unseasonably so for early May. Temperatures climbed into the 80s and the humidity pressed down like a wet blanket. By late afternoon, the National Weather Service had issued a tornado watch for much of western Kansas, including Kiowa County. The watch was routine for this time of year, and most people went about their business. Kids played in yards, farmers checked their fields, and the downtown bustled with the slow, easy rhythm of a small plains community. But the atmosphere was changing. Storm chasers and meteorologists were tracking a powerful supercell thunderstorm developing near the Colorado border. It moved east, feeding on the warm, moist air, and by early evening it began to strengthen. At 8:30 p.m., the first tornado warning was issued for Kiowa County. The storm was producing a large and extremely dangerous tornado near the town of Greensburg. Inside the Kiowa County Courthouse, the emergency management team was already at work. The small room was cluttered with maps and radios. The warning sirens had been tested just hours earlier, but now they would sound for real. The first siren wailed across town at 8:45 p.m. People who heard it knew the drill. They moved to basements, storm cellars, or interior rooms, but some hesitated. Tornadoes were a part of life, and many had weathered dozens of warnings without seeing a single funnel. That night would be different. Just south of town, a man named Harold stood on his porch and stared at the sky. He had lived in Greensburg for 50 years. He had seen storms come and go, but this one looked different. The clouds were rotating and the air had a greenish tint that he had only seen once before, decades ago. He told his wife to grab the emergency kit and get in the basement. She did not argue. The supercell continued to intensify. At 9 p.m., a spotter reported a large tornado on the ground moving directly toward Greensburg. The National Weather Service issued a tornado emergency, the highest level of alert. The message went out over NOAA weather radios. This is a life-threatening situation. Seek shelter immediately. But the tornado was already bearing down. At 9:48 p.m., the first reports of damage came in. The tornado, later classified as an EF5, the highest rating on the enhanced Fujita scale, had touched down west of town. It was enormous, estimated to be nearly 1.7 miles wide at times. Winds exceeded 200 miles per hour. The tornado was not just a narrow rope of spinning air. It was a massive, black wall of destruction that consumed everything in its path. In the path of the storm was the Greensburg High School, a sturdy brick building that had stood for decades. The tornado ripped off the roof, collapsed the walls, and scattered debris across the football field. The grain elevator, the tallest structure in town, was torn apart as if it were made of paper. Homes were flattened, trees were uprooted, and vehicles were tossed like toys. The roar was deafening, a constant grinding thunder that seemed to come from every direction at once. Down in the basements, people huddled together. Families covered their children with blankets. They held hands and prayed. The air pressure dropped so quickly that ears popped and eyes stung. Dust and grit filled every crack. Then came the sound of tearing metal and splintering wood. Those who survived said it felt like being inside a drum being beaten by a giant. Some lost consciousness from the sheer force. One family, the Millers, had just moved to Greensburg 6 months earlier. They were not used to tornadoes. When the sirens went off, they rushed to the small storm cellar in their backyard. It was cramped, dark, and damp. The father, Jake, held his 2 young daughters close. His wife, Emily, clutched a flashlight. They could hear the storm growing louder. Then came a violent thud and the cellar door buckled. The pressure forced it open and a blast of wind and debris shot into the small space. Jake threw himself over his children. He felt something hit his back, a piece of lumber probably. Then everything went quiet. The tornado passed through Greensburg in about 10 minutes. In that brief window, it destroyed more than 95% of the town. The downtown core was unrecognizable. The historic buildings, the businesses, the homes, the churches, they were all gone. Cars were wrapped around trees. The streets were covered in a thick layer of mud and splintered wood, and the silence that followed the storm was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of a place that had been erased. Emergency responders began arriving within minutes. They came from surrounding towns, from the county sheriff's office, from the state highway patrol. But they had no idea what they would find. The roads were blocked by debris. Some had to abandon their vehicles and walk. They used flashlights and headlamps because the power was out across the entire area. There was no light except for the glow of fires that had started from ruptured gas lines. The first priority was finding survivors. Rescue crews moved through the wreckage, calling out, listening for voices. They found people in basements, in bathtubs, in closets. Many were injured, some trapped under heavy beams. A woman was pulled from the rubble of her home, still holding her infant. The baby was unharmed. That story repeated itself again and again. Somehow, miraculously, despite the utter devastation, the death toll was low. 11 people lost their lives that night in Greensburg, 11 out of nearly 1,500. It was a tragedy, but it could have been far worse. In the days that followed, the world learned of Greensburg. News crews arrived from across the country. The president declared a major disaster. Aid poured in. But for the survivors, the true struggle was just beginning. They had lost everything. Their homes, their belongings, their photographs, their sense of normalcy. The tornado had not just destroyed buildings, it had erased the physical fabric of their community. And yet, in the weeks and months that followed, a remarkable thing happened. The people of Greensburg chose to rebuild, not just as a town but as a model for the future. They made a decision to build green, to create a sustainable community that would be resilient against the next disaster. It started with small steps, but it grew into a vision that would transform Greensburg into a symbol of hope. But that transformation was still far in the future. On that dark night in May, all anyone could think about was survival. In a basement on the edge of town, an elderly couple waited for dawn. They had no idea if their house was still standing. A few blocks away, a group of teenagers helped an injured neighbor carry her cat to a makeshift shelter. And at the edge of what used to be Main Street, the town's only traffic light lay twisted on the ground, its red lens shattered. Above, the sky began to clear. Stars appeared, cold and indifferent, as if nothing had happened at all. The tornado of May 4, 2007, would become one of the most studied and remembered in American history. It was a storm of unprecedented power and destruction, but it was also a storm that revealed the strength and resilience of a small Kansas town. The story was not just about the wind. It was about the people who faced it and lived to tell the tale. And that is where the true story begins, not with the destruction but with the decision to carry on. In the days to come, Greensburg would become a national story, a case study in disaster response, and a beacon of sustainable rebuilding. But first, there were bodies to recover, homes to sift through, and a community to hold together. As dawn broke on May 5th, the survivors emerged from their shelters. They walked through the debris, calling out names, searching for neighbors, for friends, for family. Some found each other and embraced. Others discovered loss. The sun rose over a landscape that looked more like a war zone than the peaceful prairie town it had been. And yet, in that early morning light, someone started to clear a path. Someone else began to stack bricks. A group of volunteers arrived with water and sandwiches. And slowly, the work began. That work would continue for years. It would require patience, money, and an extraordinary amount of community spirit. But the people of Greensburg were not strangers to hard work. They were farmers, teachers, mechanics, shopkeepers. They were the kind of folks who believed in taking care of their own, and they would need that belief now more than ever. The story of the Greensburg tornado is a story of catastrophe, but it is also a story of rebirth. It is a testament to what people can accomplish when they refuse to give up. And it is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. This is the opening of that story. The night the sky fell and the morning that followed. The sirens that wailed, the prayers that were whispered, and the determination that rose from the ruins. In the next part, we will explore the immediate aftermath, the search and rescue efforts, and the first steps toward rebuilding. But for now, close your eyes and imagine a small town in Kansas, a town that once stood tall and then did not. Picture the families who lost their homes, the children who lost their toys, the elders who lost their memories. And then picture them picking up the pieces one by one with hands that shook and hearts that hoped. That is where we begin. They came from everywhere. The first wave of rescuers were neighbors and friends, people who had crawled out of their own wrecked homes and immediately started digging through the piles of wood and brick to find others. There was no coordination at first, just raw instinct. A man named Carl, who had owned the hardware store on Main Street for 30 years, walked through the rubble of what used to be his shop carrying a crowbar. He had no idea if his house was still standing, but he knew the old couple who lived 2 blocks over were frail and likely needed help. He found them huddled in a ditch, covered in mud but alive. He helped them to the high school, which was now a triage center set up in the parking lot because the building itself was gone. Medical personnel arrived from Pratt, from Dodge City, from Wichita. They set up tents and treated wounds with whatever supplies they could scavenge. Most of the injuries were cuts, bruises, and broken bones. There were also cases of shock, dehydration, and smoke inhalation from the fires that still smoldered in the ruins of collapsed houses. The National Guard arrived by midday, bringing heavy equipment to clear roads and search for anyone still trapped. They used thermal imaging cameras and sniffer dogs. The dogs were specially trained to find living victims, but they also alerted on bodies. Each time a dog sat down and whined, the rescuers knew they had found someone who had not made it. The first official fatality was confirmed just after sunrise. An elderly man named Harold had been found in the basement of his home, but the house had collapsed directly on top of the shelter. He had been sitting in his favorite armchair, a radio still playing static beside him. His wife Margaret had survived because she was in the bathroom, which was a small interior room without windows. She was pulled out cradling a photograph of her grandchildren, her face blank with shock. She kept asking for Harold and no one wanted to tell her. Over the next 2 days, the death toll climbed slowly. 11 names. Each one was a story. The high school janitor who had stayed late to lock up and never made it home, the young mother of twins who had been caught in her car when the tornado hit, the farmer who had tried to outrun the storm in his pickup truck. Their families grieved in public in front of cameras that had descended on the town like a second invasion. Reporters from every major network stood on piles of debris and spoke into microphones, describing the devastation with words that felt inadequate. They said apocalyptic. They said unimaginable, but the survivors knew those words were too small. There was no language for what they had seen. One reporter found a little girl sitting on a flipped-over sofa in the middle of what used to be her street. She was holding a doll that was missing an arm. The reporter asked if she was okay. The girl nodded and said she was waiting for her mom to come home from work. The reporter did not have the heart to tell her that her mother's workplace, the local diner, had been flattened. The mother was among the missing. Later that evening, they found her alive in a ditch, with only a broken arm and a deep gash on her forehead. The girl was reunited with her mother in a shelter that night, and that small miracle became the headline on every local news broadcast the next morning. Those miracles were the only thing that kept the survivors from sinking into despair. Every time a trapped person was pulled out alive, every time a family was found huddled together in a basement, the rescuers felt a surge of hope. There was a story about a dog that had been missing for 3 days, and when its owner found it curled up inside a hollowed-out tree stump, he cried harder than he had when he saw the remains of his house. The dog was a small Sheltie named Rusty. He had a cut on his leg and was covered in dirt, but he wagged his tail when he saw his owner. That reunion was witnessed by a dozen volunteers, and for a moment everyone forgot the horror around them. The Federal Emergency Management Agency arrived in force by the third day. They set up a field office in a tent near the remains of the town hall. FEMA representatives handed out flyers about disaster assistance, registered survivors for temporary housing, and began the long process of assessing the damage. But the bureaucracy moved slowly. People needed food, water, and shelter immediately. The Red Cross and the Salvation Army had already deployed dozens of mobile feeding units. They set up kitchens in the parking lots of destroyed churches and served hot meals to anyone who came. The lines were long, but no one complained. People stood in silence or whispered to each other. Some shared cigarettes. Others just stared at what used to be their town, an empty lot where a home once stood. A child's bicycle twisted into a figure eight, a single wall of a house still standing with a doorframe and a window oddly untouched. Inside that window, a porcelain cat sat on a windowsill, perfectly intact. That image became iconic. Someone took a photograph of it and it appeared in newspapers around the world. It was a symbol of survival, of the random mercy that the storm had shown. But for the woman who lived there, it was just a painful reminder of what she had lost. She had collected those porcelain cats for 30 years. Most of them were shattered, only one remained. The search and rescue effort officially ended after 72 hours. By that point, every structure had been searched at least once. The death toll was confirmed at 11, and the number of injured was over 100. Miraculously, that was it. Given the sheer force of the tornado and the fact that it had struck a populated area directly, the casualty rate was almost impossibly low. Meteorologists and disaster experts would later study Greensburg to understand how so many people survived. They pointed to the early warning system, the fact that the tornado came after dark when most people were home, and the widespread use of basements and storm cellars in Kansas. But the survivors knew there was something else. Luck, sheer, blind luck. In the weeks that followed, the town became a laboratory for disaster recovery. The state and federal governments poured resources into Greensburg. President George W. Bush visited the site on May 9th, walking through the rubble and meeting with survivors. He promised that the federal government would do everything in its power to help rebuild. And then came the question that would define the next chapter of Greensburg's story: how to rebuild. The town had been flattened. 95% of the structures were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. There was no blueprint for rebuilding a town from scratch, so the community had to choose. They could simply rebuild the same kind of town that had been there before, a typical Kansas farming community with houses, shops, and grain elevators, or they could do something different. It started with a conversation in a FEMA trailer. A group of residents and local officials sat around a folding table, drinking bad coffee and discussing what they wanted the new Greensburg to look like. Someone mentioned solar power. Someone else mentioned energy efficiency. A third person said, if we are going to do this, let us do it right. Let us build a town that is better than before. Let us build a town that can withstand the next storm, that uses less energy, that is healthier for the people who live here. That conversation sparked a movement. The city council, led by Mayor John Jansen, voted to adopt a resolution that all new municipal buildings would be built to the highest green building standards. They would aim for leadership in energy and environmental design, or LEED Platinum certification. It was an audacious goal. No small town in America had ever attempted anything like it. But the people of Greensburg were not afraid of hard work. They had already survived the worst. Building a green town seemed almost easy by comparison. Critics said it was too expensive. They said the town could not afford to go green when so many families were still living in trailers. But the supporters argued that the long-term savings in energy costs would more than pay for the upfront investment. And beyond the economics, there was a moral imperative. The tornado had been a natural disaster, but climate change was making such storms more frequent and more intense. Greensburg could not stop the weather, but they could build a community that was resilient. They could set an example for the rest of the world. The first green building to go up was the new Greensburg High School. It was designed with geothermal heating and cooling, solar panels, a rainwater collection system, and materials that were locally sourced and sustainably harvested. It became the first public school in the United States to earn LEED Platinum certification. When it opened, students walked into a building that was not just a place to learn, but a living lesson in environmental stewardship. They could see the solar panels on the roof, the wind turbines in the field next to the school, and the water recycling system in the basement. They learned about energy efficiency in their science classes by studying the building itself. Other buildings followed. The new city hall, the county courthouse, the community center, even the grain elevator was rebuilt with energy-efficient designs. The entire town became a showcase for sustainable development. Architects and engineers from around the world came to Greensburg to see what had been done. Documentaries were made, awards were given. Greensburg became a symbol of hope in the face of catastrophe, but the transformation was not without struggle. Many residents resisted the changes. They felt that the green movement was being imposed on them by outsiders, by environmentalists who did not understand their way of life. There were heated debates at town hall meetings. Some families chose to leave rather than rebuild under the new regulations. Others stayed but fought the changes every step of the way. It took years of compromise, of listening, of finding common ground. The town had to learn to balance the vision of sustainability with the practical needs of the people who called Greensburg home. One of the most difficult challenges was housing. Many families did not have insurance that covered the full cost of rebuilding. They had to rely on government assistance, loans, and charity. Habitat for Humanity built dozens of energy-efficient homes. Local churches organized rebuilding crews. Volunteers came from all over the country, sleeping in tents and cots, working from dawn to dusk. They hammered nails, laid insulation, installed solar panels. And slowly the town began to take shape again. There is a story that captures the spirit of those early rebuilding days. A volunteer from a large city on the East Coast was helping to frame a house. He was a college student who had never held a hammer before. He worked alongside a retired farmer named Bob who had lost his own home in the tornado. They did not talk much at first, but as they worked, Bob began to tell stories about the old Greensburg, about the carnival they used to have every 4th of July, about the time a tornado warning sent everyone into the storm cellar and someone brought a jar of pickles and they all sat in the dark eating pickles and laughing. The volunteer listened and kept working. By the end of the week, the house was framed. The volunteer went home, but he left something behind. He left a piece of himself in that town, and that is how Greensburg was rebuilt. Not just with nails and lumber, but with stories and sweat and love. The new Greensburg that emerged from the rubble was not perfect. There were still empty lots, still families that had not returned, still wounds that would take generations to heal. But there was also a spirit that had been forged in the storm. A spirit that said, "We will not be defeated. We will rise up from this destruction and build something that honors what was lost." Years later, a memorial was erected on the site of the old city hall. It was a simple structure, a curved wall made of bricks salvaged from the ruins, with a timeline of the tornado carved into the stone. Visitors would stand there and read the words. May 4th, 2007, 9:42 p.m. They would look out at the new town, at the solar panels glinting in the sun, at the wind turbines spinning in the Kansas breeze, and they would understand that something extraordinary had happened here. A town had been destroyed and a town had been reborn. The story of Greensburg is not just about a tornado. It is about the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to create meaning out of chaos. It is about the decision to build not just houses but hope. And that hope, like the stars that appeared after the storm, will continue to shine long after the winds have died. And yet, even as those solar panels caught the morning light and the wind turbines hummed their steady song, not every survivor found hope so easily. There were those who could not shake the sound of that wind, a low roar that seemed to live inside their heads. They would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, certain that the walls were about to collapse. For them, the new Greensburg was a constant reminder of what had been taken. The old downtown, with its drugstore and hardware store and the diner where everyone knew your name, was gone. The new buildings were sleek and energy efficient, but they did not smell like the old ones. They did not have the worn floorboards or the faded photographs on the walls. Some people said the new town was a showpiece for environmentalists, but it did not feel like home. One of those people was Martha Collins. She had lived in Greensburg for 42 years. Her house had been on the edge of town, a modest farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a lilac bush her mother had planted. The tornado took everything, including her husband, Tom. He had been in the backyard trying to secure the storm cellar door when the wind picked him up and threw him 200 yards. Martha found him the next morning, lying in a wheat field, his eyes open, his face peaceful. She never moved back into the rebuilt Greensburg. Instead, she moved to a small apartment in a neighboring town. She could not bear to see the solar panels and the geothermal wells. To her, they were monuments to a future she did not want to be part of, but her daughter, Rachel, stayed. Rachel was 23 when the tornado hit, living in Wichita but visiting her parents that weekend. She survived by huddling in the bathroom of the farmhouse with her mother and father. She felt her father leave her side, heard him yell something she could not understand, and then the wall dissolved into splinters. When she emerged from the rubble, her mother was bleeding from a gash on her head and her father was gone. Rachel moved back to Greensburg after the funeral. She said she needed to rebuild something, anything, to make sense of the chaos. She got a job with the city planning department working on the Green Initiative. She learned about insulation R values and photovoltaic efficiency. She became the town's expert on LEED certification. Every time a new building went up, she was there with her clipboard and her hard hat making sure the specifications were met. She poured her grief into the work. Some people said she was running from the pain, maybe she was. But she was also building a new home, not just for herself, but for everyone. The tension between those who embraced the new Greensburg and those who mourned the old one was the fault line that ran through every town meeting. In the first few years after the tornado, the meetings were packed. People came to argue about zoning, about building codes, about the cost of solar panels. One night, a farmer named Henry Wetzel stood up and shouted that the town council was turning Greensburg into a science experiment for rich people from California. He had lost his grain elevator, his barn, and 3 of his best cattle. He had rebuilt his house using a government loan, but he could not afford the solar panels or the geothermal system. His house was plain and conventional, and he felt like a second-class citizen in a town that celebrated green architecture. The mayor, John Jansen, listened. He was a quiet man, balding, with a face that had been weathered by decades of Kansas sun. He had lost his own home in the tornado, and he had spent the first 6 months sleeping in a camper. He understood Henry's anger. He also understood that if Greensburg were to truly rise from the rubble, it had to do so as a community, not as a collection of gleaming showpieces and ordinary homes. He proposed a compromise. The town would offer rebates for energy-efficient upgrades paid for by grants and donations. No one would be forced to build green, but those who chose to do so would get help. It was not enough to satisfy everyone, but it was a start. The real turning point came when the solar panels on the high school produced a surplus of electricity in the first summer. The utility company sent a check to the school district for $3,000. The school board used the money to buy new computers for the library. That story spread through Greensburg like a prairie fire. If a school could save money by generating its own power, maybe a family could too. Within a year, a dozen homes had installed solar panels. Within 2 years, more than 50 small businesses followed. The new diner, called the Sunflower, put a small wind turbine on its roof. The owner, a woman named Lucy who had lost her old restaurant in the tornado, said that every time the turbine spun, she thought of the wind that had taken everything from her. Now she was using that wind to power her fryers and her coffee maker. It was a kind of revenge, she told a reporter, a peaceful one. As the town rebuilt, it also became a destination. Tourists came from across the country and around the world. They took photographs of the solar panels, the rain gardens, the permeable pavement. They stayed in the new bed and breakfast that was built with reclaimed wood and non-toxic paint. They ate at the Sunflower and bought souvenirs at the gift shop that sold t-shirts printed with the words Greensburg, rebuilt green. Some of the locals resented the attention. They felt like they were living in a museum, but others saw an opportunity. A few enterprising residents started a company that gave tour of the town's green features. They charged $15 per person. The money went into a fund to help low-income families weatherize their homes. One of the tour guides was a teenager named Derek. He was 6 years old when the tornado hit. He remembered being in the bathtub with his mother and his little sister holding a mattress over their heads. He remembered the sound, like a train, like 1,000 trains, and then the silence. After the storm, he had walked through the ruins and found his bicycle twisted into a knot of metal. He had cried not because of the bike, but because the house where he had lived was gone and his neighbors were dead. Now, 10 years later, he led groups of strangers through the town and explained how the rainwater collection system worked. He showed them the community garden that had replaced a block of destroyed homes. He spoke with a kind of pride that surprised even himself. He had not planned to stay in Greensburg. He had thought he would leave for college and never come back, but something held him there. Maybe it was the memory of that night, the way strangers had come together to dig through debris with their bare hands. Maybe it was the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. He did not know. But every time a tour group applauded at the end, he felt a warmth spread through his chest, and he knew he was exactly where he belonged. The outsiders came bearing not just curiosity but also expertise. A team of engineers from the University of Kansas arrived to study the tornado's path and the structural performance of buildings that had survived. They measured wind speeds from the debris patterns and concluded that the F5 rating was accurate, but that some buildings had performed better than expected because of simple design features, like reinforced roof-to-wall connections and impact-resistant windows. Their research influenced building codes across Tornado Alley. Insurance companies began offering discounts for homes that met certain resilience standards. Architects incorporated lessons from Greensburg into new designs for schools and hospitals. The tragedy had become a classroom, but the most important lessons were not technical, they were human. A few years after the tornado, a researcher from a university in the Northeast came to Greensburg to study the psychological impact of the disaster. She interviewed dozens of survivors, including Martha Collins, the woman who had moved away. Martha told her that she still had nightmares. She said that every time the wind picked up, she would check the weather channel and stare at the radar. She had installed a storm siren alert app on her phone. She was always ready to run, even though she had nowhere to run to. The researcher asked her what she needed most. Martha thought for a long time. Then she said, "I need to know that it meant something, that all of it, the death and the destruction and the pain, that it added up to something more than just a weather event." The researcher wrote about that conversation in her paper. She argued that the success of any post-disaster rebuilding project depends not just on physical reconstruction, but on the creation of meaning. Greensburg had done that, she said, by giving the survivors a story they could tell themselves. The story of a town that had been destroyed and rebuilt better. That story gave them a framework for understanding their loss. It allowed them to transform grief into purpose. For Martha, the story was not enough. She could not see the solar panels as symbols of renewal. She saw them as reminders of a world that had moved on without her. But for Rachel, for Derek, for the hundreds of others who stayed, the story was a lifeline. The physical rebuilding took nearly a decade. The last FEMA trailer was removed 6 years after the tornado. The last vacant lot was filled with a new house 11 years after the storm. By then, the population had stabilized at around 800, down from the 1,500 that had lived there before the tornado, but higher than the lowest point in 2008 when only 400 people remained. The town had shrunk, but it had also become more cohesive. The people who stayed were the ones who had chosen to be there. They had weathered the storm and the long recovery. They knew each other's stories. They knew who had lost a spouse, who had lost a child, who had lost a pet. They knew who had rebuilt with their own hands and who had hired contractors. They knew who had fought the green mandate and who had embraced it, and they knew that they would never be the same. There is a scene that stays with everyone who lived through it. On the 10-year anniversary of the tornado, the town held a ceremony in the new park, a green space built on the site of the old city hall. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the grass. A choir from the high school sang a hymn. A pastor spoke about hope and resurrection. Then a woman named Ella, who had been the town librarian before the tornado, stepped up to the microphone. She was old, maybe 80, with white hair and a voice that quavered. She held a small box made of salvaged wood. In that box was a jar of pickles. She told the crowd that on the night of the storm, she and her neighbors had sat in a storm cellar and passed around a jar of pickles, laughing and crying and waiting for the end. That jar of pickles had become a symbol for her of the absurdity and tenderness of survival. She had kept it all these years, the jar still unopened, the pickles still pickled. She said she was going to open it now, and she wanted everyone to take a bite. Not because the pickles were special, but because the act of sharing them was. She unscrewed the lid and the smell of vinegar and dill filled the air. People lined up, each taking a pickle slice, chewing silently. Some laughed, some cried. It was a strange and beautiful ritual, and in that moment the town of Greensburg was not a showcase of sustainability or a symbol of resilience. It was just a group of people standing together in the fading light, eating pickles from a jar that had survived a tornado. And that was enough. After the pickle ceremony, the crowd lingered in the park, not wanting to go home. Children chased fireflies while adults sat on benches, talking in low voices. Someone produced a guitar, and soon a few people were singing old folk songs. It was not a celebration exactly, but it was not a mourning either. It was something in between, a gathering of people who had shared a profound experience and were still trying to understand what it meant. The 10-year anniversary marked a turning point. After that, the town entered a new phase, one that was less about rebuilding and more about living. The solar panels continued to generate power, the rain gardens continued to filter water, and the grass in the park continued to grow. But the urgency was gone. The trauma had settled into something deeper, something that shaped the way people moved through their days. Bob Dixon, the mayor who had championed the green rebuild, stepped down the following year. He was tired. He had spent a decade fighting for permits, convincing skeptics, and attending meetings. He had stood on the roof of the new city hall and watched his town rise from the dust. Now he wanted to fish. He wanted to sit on the bank of the creek that ran along the edge of town and not think about solar incentives or stormwater runoff. At his farewell speech, he told the crowd that he had never been prouder of anything in his life, but that he was ready to be just a regular citizen again. He wanted to complain about the price of gasoline and argue about baseball scores like everyone else. The crowd laughed and clapped, and then they presented him with a plaque made from the wood of a tree that had fallen in the tornado. He cried. He did not try to hide it. He cried, and it was okay. Rachel Connor, who had been the first to open a business after the storm, expanded the Sunflower into a second location, this time in a nearby town that had also been hit by a tornado, though not as severe. She hired local teenagers and taught them how to cook. She became something of a minor celebrity, invited to speak at conferences about sustainable business practices. She always began her talks the same way. She would walk to the podium, stand in silence for a moment, and then say, "I lost everything on May 4th, 2007. I had nothing, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me." The audience would shift in their seats, unsure how to respond. And then she would tell them about the wind, about the silence, about the fire that ran on the sun. By the end, they were on their feet, but not everyone found meaning so easily. There were those who could not shake the fear. A woman named Patricia, who had lost her husband in the storm, moved to Colorado but came back every year for the anniversary. She would stand at the edge of the park and watch the ceremony from a distance, never joining the crowd. She could not bear to be in the middle of people who were smiling. To her, the town's transformation felt like a betrayal of the dead. How could they laugh and sing and celebrate solar panels when her husband was buried 6 feet under? She brought flowers to the cemetery, then drove back to Colorado the same night. She did not tell anyone she was coming. A study published 5 years after the tornado examined suicide rates in Greensburg compared to other disaster-stricken towns. The numbers were lower than expected. The researchers hypothesized that the strong community identity and the sense of purpose provided by the rebuild had a protective effect, but they also noted that the sample size was small and that the results might not be generalizable. In other words, Greensburg was lucky. It had the right people at the right time. It had a mayor who believed in something bigger, a federal funding stream that aligned with a political moment, and a core of survivors who refused to give up. That combination was rare. For every Greensburg, there were a dozen towns that faded away, their populations trickling down to nothing, their empty lots overgrown with weeds. The school became a focal point for the next generation. The new building was state-of-the-art, with geothermal heating and daylighting that reduced energy costs. But more importantly, it was a place where children could process what had happened. A counselor was brought in to work with students who had symptoms of post-traumatic stress. She held group sessions where kids could draw pictures of the tornado, write stories, or simply sit in silence. One boy named Ethan drew the same image every time, a black spiral with a house in the middle. He never spoke during the sessions, but his drawings grew more detailed over the years. The spiral became smaller, the house became larger. One day in his last year of high school, he showed the counselor a drawing of a house with a window. Inside the window was a face. He said, "That's me, I'm looking out." The counselor told him that was progress. He shrugged, but he kept the drawing. The town's story spread beyond Kansas. It was featured in documentaries and news segments. Architects from Japan came to visit. City planners from Germany took notes. A delegation from New Orleans arrived, still reeling from Hurricane Katrina, to see if any of Greensburg's lessons could apply to their own rebuilding. They walked through the streets nodding politely, but they seemed skeptical. The scale of Katrina was different, the politics more complex. Still, they took pictures, they asked questions, and they left with a binder full of information that sat on a shelf in a city office gathering dust. The Green Revolution, as the media called it, had its critics. Some accused Greensburg of being a vanity project, a showcase for wealthy environmentalists while the working class struggled. It was true that the cost of living had risen. The new houses were efficient, but they were also more expensive to build. Some of the old residents could not afford to return. They sold their lots to developers and moved to cheaper towns. And there was an irony that many noted. The town that had rebuilt Green was still located in the middle of Tornado Alley, still vulnerable to the very forces it had tried to master. A severe storm could undo everything. The solar panels could be smashed. The rain gardens could be flooded. The Green Mandate could be erased in a single afternoon, but the people who stayed did not dwell on that. They lived with the risk the way people everywhere live with risks they cannot control. They checked the radar in spring and listened for sirens. They kept flashlights in their closets and bottled water in their pantries, and they went about their lives. They fell in love, they had children, they grew old, they died. The tornado had taught them that the future was not guaranteed, so they held on to what they had. One afternoon, about 12 years after the storm, a man named Frank was driving through Greensburg on his way to visit his daughter in Wichita. He had not been to the town since before the tornado. He had been a traveling salesman covering the region, and he remembered Greensburg as a sleepy little place with a diner and a motel. He pulled over at the new gas station, which was powered by solar panels on its canopy. He bought a soda and stood outside looking around. The streets were clean. The houses were modern. There was a bike path and a sign that said Greensburg, a green community. He finished his soda and got back in his car. As he drove away, he thought about how strange it was that something so terrible could produce something so unexpected. He did not know if he liked it or not, but he knew he would not forget it. For the survivors, the memories did not fade. They became layered. Every anniversary brought a new wave of grief and gratitude. The town held a candlelight vigil each year, walking the path of the tornado's destruction, lighting candles at the sites where people had died. The list of names was read aloud. Some years it was done by a single voice, other years by a chorus of children. The children did not know the people who had died. They had been born after the storm, but they learned the names. They learned the stories. They became the keepers of the memory, and the wind kept blowing. It rattled the windows of the new houses. It rustled the leaves of the trees that had been planted in the park. It spun the blades of the wind turbine that stood on the edge of town, a tall white tower that generated enough electricity to power 20 homes. The wind was no longer an enemy. It was a resource. It was a reminder. It was the same wind that had howled through the night of May 4, 2007, but now it was harnessed, measured, and put to use. The people of Greensburg had not defeated the wind. They had learned to live with it. On the 15th anniversary, the town dedicated a memorial. It was not a traditional monument, not a statue or a plaque. It was a grove of trees, one for each of the 11 people who had died. The trees were native species, hardy and resilient, chosen to withstand the harsh Kansas climate. They were planted in a circle with a bench in the middle where people could sit and think. The bench was made from the wood of a barn that had collapsed in the storm, salvaged and planed smooth. A local artist had carved a spiral into the backrest, the same spiral that the boy Ethan had drawn so many years ago. The artist had seen his drawing at a school art show and asked for permission to use it. Ethan was 21 by then, studying engineering at the University of Kansas. He said yes. At the dedication, the wind was strong, whipping hair across faces and making the microphone crackle. The mayor at the time, a woman named Denise who had been a nurse during the recovery, gave a short speech. She said that the trees would grow and their roots would spread, and that one day the grove would be a shady place where children could play and lovers could sit. She said that the dead were not forgotten, but that they were also not the only story. The story of Greensburg was not just about loss. It was about what came after. It was about the choice to stay and build and plant and grow. It was about the wind that carried seeds and the rain that watered them. After the speech, people walked among the trees, touching the bark, reading the small stones that marked each one. A woman knelt by a tree that had been planted for her mother. She placed her hand on the ground and whispered something. Then she stood up and wiped her eyes and walked away. The town continued to evolve. The population hovered around 1,000, a number that seemed stable. The school district consolidated with a neighboring county, so the children went to class in a different building now. The grocery store closed and reopened as a co-op. The hardware store expanded. The library got a new wing filled with books that had been donated from across the country. The town was not frozen in time. It was alive, messy, and ordinary. The solar panels needed maintenance. The rain gardens got clogged. The Green Mandate had been updated and revised, and some of the original rules had been relaxed. There were still arguments at city council meetings about budgets and zoning and whether to allow a fast food chain on the highway. But underneath it all, there was a thread of understanding that ran through the community. It was not spoken aloud often, but everyone felt it. They had been through something together, they had survived, and because they had survived, they owed something to each other. A kindness, a patience, a willingness to help when the wind picked up and the sirens blared. When the sirens did blare, which happened every spring, the town responded with practiced calm. People went to their basements, their storm cellars, the interior hallways of the public buildings. They brought their pets and their phones and their emergency kits. They sat in the dark and listened to the wind. Sometimes it was just a storm, a typical Kansas squall that passed in 20 minutes. Sometimes it was worse. But every time the all-clear sounded, they emerged and checked on their neighbors. They looked at the sky and the ground and each other. They knew that the next tornado could come at any time. It might be a weaker storm that only tore off a few shingles, or it might be the one that flattened them again, and if it did, they would rebuild. They would not rebuild the same way, of course, because you can never go back to what you were, but they would rebuild. They would gather in the park and pass around a jar of pickles. They would tell the stories. They would plant new trees. And the cycle would continue as it does on this restless planet where the wind never stops blowing and the people never stop hoping. The last thing to be built in Greensburg was a small stone wall along the edge of the park. It was a low wall, no higher than a person's waist, and it was made from the rubble of the old buildings that had been demolished after the tornado. The stones were rough and uneven, some still bearing the scars of the storm. A metal plaque was embedded in the wall with an inscription that had been chosen by a committee of survivors. It read, "We were broken by the wind, we were made by the wind, we are the wind." On the day the wall was finished, a group of schoolchildren came to see it. They ran their hands over the stones, feeling the texture. A teacher explained what the words meant. A little girl asked, "Does that mean we are inside the tornado?" The teacher paused, then said, "No, it means the tornado is inside us. And we decide what it becomes." The girl looked puzzled. Then she shrugged and ran off to play on the swings, and the wind blew through the trees, through the solar panels, through the streets of the town. It carried the sound of children laughing and the smell of fresh bread from the sunflower and the distant rumble of thunder on the horizon. It was the same wind that had torn Greensburg apart, and it was the same wind that had brought it back to life. The story of Greensburg is not over. It will never be over. It will be told and retold, in documentaries and classrooms and around dinner tables, as long as there is someone to listen. It is a story about a place that was destroyed and chose to become something new. It is a story about people who refused to give up. It is a story about the wind, the endless wind of the plains that takes and gives and takes again, leaving behind only what we build from the wreckage. And in that town, on that flat stretch of Kansas where the sky is wide and the horizon never ends, there are people who wake up every morning and look at the sun and the wind and the green roofs and the rain gardens, and they remember. They remember the silence after the storm, the dust settling on the broken things. They remember the hands that pulled them from the debris. They remember the jar of pickles, and they know that they are part of something larger than themselves. They are part of the wind. They are part of the wind, and the wind is part of them. It moves through their days and their dreams, a constant companion that never fully quiets. There is a man named Frank who lives on the edge of town in a house that was built after the storm. He was a farmer before the tornado, and he lost everything except his wife and his dog. He rebuilt his life slowly, planting new fields of wheat and corn, watching the seasons turn. Now he is old, his hands gnarled from work, his eyes pale blue like the Kansas sky. Every evening he sits on his porch and watches the wind sweep across the prairie. He can tell by the smell if rain is coming or if the air is too dry or if something darker is brewing. He has seen a lot of storms in his long life, and he knows that the next one could be the one that takes what little he has left. But he does not fear that. He fears nothing now except the idea of leaving his wife behind. His wife, Martha, a woman who once taught piano in the old school, has dementia now. She cannot remember the tornado or the years that followed or even Frank sometimes. But she remembers the music. On good days, she sits at the upright piano that was donated by a church in Colorado and she plays. She plays the same songs she played for her students decades ago, simple melodies that drift out through the open window and mingle with the wind. Frank listens from the porch, and he cries without making a sound. He cries for the woman she was, for the life they had, for the town they rebuilt. But he also cries because he is grateful. Grateful that they survived, grateful that they stayed, grateful that the wind did not take her from him entirely. The music is their thread. It binds them to each other and to the past. In the center of town, the library has a small recording studio now, built with a grant from a university research project. Young people come in to record podcasts, music, stories. A teenager named Jada, who was born a few years after the tornado, produces a series called Voices of the Wind. She interviews old-timers, newcomers, anyone who has a story to tell about Greensburg. She is tall and quiet with a serious face and a notebook full of questions. She has interviewed Frank sitting in his kitchen, the wind rattling the door. She has interviewed the man who built the greenhouses, the woman who started the co-op, the children who were born on the night of the storm. She has collected hours of recordings, and she is planning to make a documentary that will be shown at the film festival in Wichita. She wants the world to know that Greensburg is not just a town that survived a tornado. It is a town that learned to listen. One afternoon, Jada walks to the memorial grove. She has never met the 11 people whose names are carved on the stones, but she knows their stories. She knows that Mrs. Olson, who died in her bathtub, loved lilacs. She knows that Mr. Carter, the janitor, had a secret talent for painting miniatures. She knows that the little girl Emma had a pet rabbit named Fluff. Jada sits on the bench carved with the spiral, which is now smooth and warm from the sun. She closes her eyes and feels the wind on her face. She opens her notebook and writes a poem. It is not a good poem, but it is honest. It starts with the line, "The wind is a language I am learning to speak." She reads it aloud, and the wind carries the words across the grove through the leaves of the 11 trees. A leaf breaks free and spins upward, caught in a gust. Jada watches it disappear into the blue. The town's water tower, which was rebuilt with a new design after the storm, has a mural now. It was painted by a local artist who used to work as a graphic designer in Chicago before she moved to Greensburg after the tornado. The mural shows a family of trees with roots that spiral into the earth, and above them a sky full of stars and clouds and birds. The artist, whose name is Alina, says the mural is about connection. She says the roots go down deep, but the branches reach up high and the wind moves between them. She painted it over the course of a summer, working from a lift, the sun burning her arms. People would stop and watch her, sometimes bringing water or sandwiches. By the time she finished, the mural had become a landmark, a place where people took photos, where children pointed and asked what the swirls meant. Alina would smile and say, "It means that everything is held together by something invisible." And so the town lived. The hardware store sold nails and paint and garden hoses. The co-op sold organic apples and locally made soap. The post office still had the same cluttered bulletin board, covered in flyers for lost cats, garage sales, and community meetings. The wind spun the blades of the turbine day and night, a steady hum that was almost unnoticeable until it stopped. When the turbine stopped for maintenance, a strange quiet settled over the town. People noticed. They missed the sound. They had gotten used to it, the way you get used to the ticking of a clock or the heartbeat of someone you love. One night in late spring, a storm came. It was not a tornado, but a straight-line windstorm that knocked down fences and tore branches from trees. The power went out for 3 days. The town went dark and people dug out their candles and their flashlights. They gathered in the park in the shelter of the stone wall and they talked. They talked about the old days, about the summer of the rescue dogs and the jars of pickles. They talked about the night they had all knelt on the concrete pad, the words rising around them. Someone brought a guitar and they sang. They sang old songs and new songs, songs about the plains and the sky and the endless road. The wind howled around them, but they did not go home. They stayed together, huddled against the wall, their voices rising into the dark. The next morning, the sun came up bright and clean, and the debris was scattered across the streets. People began to clean up without waiting for an order. Children picked up sticks. Adults dragged fallen branches to the curb. The power company arrived by noon, and by evening the lights were on again. The town was not destroyed. It was just bruised. It healed as it always did. And the wind kept blowing. It would keep blowing for 1,000 years across the same fields, over the same graves, through the same generations of people who chose to live in its path. They would build and rebuild, plant and replant, love and lose and love again. They would tell the stories of the ones who came before and the ones who would come after. They knew in the deepest part of their hearts that the wind did not care. It was not cruel and it was not kind. It simply was. But the people made meaning from it. They shaped their lives around its force and its mercy. They turned its violence into architecture, its memory into art, its silence into prayer. The last line of Alina's mural, written in tiny letters near the bottom, is a quote from a poem she found in the library. It says, "We are not the wind. We are the song the wind carries. And that song, the song of Greensburg, will never end. It will be sung on porches and in basements, in classrooms and on the radio, in the rustle of the trees and the hum of the turbine, and in the quiet moments when the air is still and the world holds its breath. It will be sung by Frank, who hums as he ties up his tomato plants. It will be sung by Jada, who records her podcast in the library studio. It will be sung by the children who plant new flowers in the rain garden every spring. It will be sung by the wind itself as it passes through the grove, over the stone wall, across the curved horizon of the Kansas plains. The song is the memory. The song is the hope. The song is the story of a town that was broken and made and became the wind.